हेलो एवरीवन, जैसा कि आपने लास्ट वीडियो में देखा कि मैं फ्रैंकफर्ट आ गया था और मैं आया था रोमरबर्ग स्क्वायर पे। और हम यहाँ पे वेट कर रहे थे अपने गाइड का, ताकि फ्रैंकफर्ट का गाइडेड टूर स्टार्ट कर पाएँ। और यहाँ पे ये जो धरना प्रदर्शन चल रहा है, इसके बारे में मैंने आपको लास्ट वीडियो में बताया ही था। और अब यहाँ पे ग्रुप के बाकी लोग और गाइड भी आ गए हैं। सो लेट्स स्टार्ट अ गाइडेड टूर ऑफ फ्रैंकफर्ट।
Okay, so welcome everyone to the free alternative walking tour in English today. So glad that you are here. And yeah, so just for the beginning, I want to introduce you a little bit more the concept of the free alternative walking tours. So the tours are organized by students. Most of the tour guides are students. And for myself, my name is Janus, and I'm a student too. So I study history at Goethe University, right here in Frankfurt. So I tell you a little bit more of the history of Frankfurt today. And by the way, the tour is for free, so you don't have to pay for it. But because we as tour guides or we as students, we aren't paid by the city or by any company or by any platform. So that's the reason why the tour is based on tips. So if you enjoyed the tour or if it was worth for you, you can give a little tip at the end. And and if you want, you can give some feedback at the end how the tour was for you. Suppose you can make some space for the truck for a moment. Sorry. And as I said, you can give feedback at the end how the tour was for you. And so wherever you find us at Google Walk or TripAdvisor or Free Tour or wherever you want. And at Facebook, we load up some pictures to promote our tours. So if it is okay for you, I would make a picture for the beginning, and if not, it's no problem, so you don't have to be on the picture. So you can be right here on my side. And yes, so I would make the picture right here in front of that building for the beginning, and then we can start. So 1, 2, 3. Okay. Perfect. So just for the beginning, before we really start, there's only one thing to say. Right here it's a little bit better than some meters in the direction of the square, but nevertheless, and that's for the whole tour, if you have to speak a little bit louder or a little bit clearer, or if you have any questions, just say it and I do my best to answer your questions. And but first of all, I have a question to you. So when you think about Frankfurt, what is your first expectation of the city, or your first thoughts and your first imagination?
Financial center.
Finance, okay.
International airport.
International airport, okay. Sausage, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so these are some really good points. So, for example, for the sausage, that's one part I want to introduce you a little bit more later. So I want to introduce you a little bit more of the local food. So not only the sausage, some other things too, some other local stuff. And the airport is one other really important thing for Frankfurt, because one is the international airport inside of Frankfurt. So just some kilometers in that direction to my right or in my back. And there's another airport, which is much more far away, with the name Frankfurt Hahn. So it's nearly in the middle of the nowhere, but it is named after the city of Frankfurt. So, and I heard that some persons came to that airport and they wanted to come to Frankfurt, but they had to move or they had to travel around 2 or 2.5 more hours to come to Frankfurt. So there's another airport called Frankfurt, but Frankfurt International, so right here inside of the city, just some meters in that, or some kilometers in that direction, really close to the stadium. That's the biggest in Germany. And that is just some parts. So one other part is, for example, finance. And Frankfurt is like a financial city or like a financial hub in Germany, with many banks inside of Germany or inside of Frankfurt, which are part of some banks. Or the other way around, some skyscrapers. Welcome.
Due to the orange.
Yeah, lots of banks. So, for example, like Commerzbank, for example, the Commerzbank Tower is the highest skyscraper in whole Germany, and in the same time in Frankfurt. So, so Commerzbank is a German bank, and another bank which is located inside of Frankfurt is, for example, the European Central Bank. So just some 100 meters in that direction, to your back and behind the building. So Frankfurt is really a financial city, and by the way, 14 of the 15 highest buildings in Germany are right here in Frankfurt. So that's the reason why we have the only skyline in whole Germany. It's not really a comparison to some cities like New York, Shanghai or Singapore, I know, but for Germany it's the only skyline we have. And it's a financial city, or the financial center, and the central railway station. And in that district there are many persons who are consuming drugs and homeless persons. So many persons don't feel so secure in that area. But nevertheless it's part of Frankfurt. But today we are more in the city center of Frankfurt, so more right here in that area. But so it's another district. And I want to introduce a little bit more Römerberg, so the place where we normally started, or where we normally start, so just some meters away because of the demonstration. So as you can see, Römerberg is really important for Frankfurt today. So one example is there are some demonstrations during the year. So it's not the only demonstration, and there are some other reasons why that places the local soccer team won the Europa League a little bit more than 2 years ago. Yes, at the team returned to Frankfurt. The team was welcomed right there at the balcony. It was celebrated by thousands of fans right there to that square. And just some weeks ago, we had the European Championship in Germany with some games in Frankfurt. So I saw that there were some fans who celebrated their team at that place. So for example, I saw some fans from Switzerland who made some fondue at the fountain, or really close to the fountain. So it's just like a meeting place for many different parts in Frankfurt. And yes, so just for the name of that place, the name Römerberg is because of the building with the flags. So where the little tribunes for the demonstrations in front of, that building is called Römer, so the Rome. And the reason for the name of that building, Römer, the Rome, is simply that there was something like a market inside during the Middle Ages, and at that market there were many merchants from Italy. Because the Italians were just called Römer, the Romans in the Middle Ages, that's one reason, or one explanation why that building is called Römer. More to your right, you can see a picture on the wall which is telling you the legend of the foundation. And the legend is saying that one day the Frankish king Charlemagne came to a river with the name Main. That river, Main, is right on the other side, so in that direction, just some meters. And he wanted to cross the river with his army, but he didn't know where and how he can do this. And suddenly he saw a deer, and that deer was crossing the river through a ford. And he followed the deer, and in exactly that place where he crossed the river, he founded a city with the name Frankfurt, the fort of the Franks. And that is just a legend, so we can't really say if it is true or not. But what we can say is that this city, which is Frankfurt today, was firstly named in a document of the year 794. So it was really the time of Charlemagne. And for more than 1,000 years, Frankfurt had only one bridge to connect both sides of the river. And the bridge on that place today is called, because of that, Alte Brücke, the old bridge. And just the second bridge that was built in Frankfurt was Eiserner Steg, the Iron Bridge. And with that bridge you can see right between that building, so behind the trees. And Eiserner Steg was built in the 1940s. And in that times, so in the middle of the 19th century, the Iron Bridge was, or many citizens of Frankfurt were really proud about that bridge because it was financed by themselves. And just later, during World War II, it was completely destroyed, the bridge, but not by some bombings, but by the Germans themselves, because the Germans wanted to make it harder for the Allies to cross big rivers, like the River of Main, for example. So after the Second World War, the bridge, or the Iron Bridge, had to be rebuilt. And today there are, of course, many more bridges in Frankfurt, but these two, so the Old Bridge and the Iron Bridge, might be the most important or the most famous bridges in Frankfurt today. And yeah, so that's for the bridges themselves for the moment. For now, I want to introduce you a little bit more the oldest original building in the city center. And that's the building to my right and my back with the name Haus Wertheim. That building is the oldest original building in the city center. So it was built in around 1600, so a little bit more than 400 years old. And it might be with that age there are some other buildings with the same age in another quarter of Frankfurt in the southwest with the name Höchst, but or which might be a little bit older. But in the city center, that building is the oldest one we have, or the oldest original building. And the reason I heard that this building remained from the times before World War II is simply that right here there was the way of evacuation for the persons who lived in the city center. So during the bombings during World War II, they fled to the river of Main, and the fire brigade used some water to make the building wet. So because they had, so the building couldn't catch fire. The reason is that the persons had a little bit of safer way to come to the river. So that's the legend I heard why that building remained from the times before World War II. And yeah, so just today it's there's a site, so on the right a restaurant, and on the left there's something like a bakery. So there's no bread inside, so it's not really a classical bakery, but nevertheless there's some other local stuff of food inside. So that's, by the way, for the modern use of that building. And yeah, so that's for the moment. Do you have some questions until now? Now we go to the right. Okay. So right here on that place, I have another question to you. So when you look around, what do you guess? How old are the buildings around us? Any ideas? After the war. After the war, okay. Okay. Yeah, so to be honest, it was a little tricky question because right here there was one of the biggest old towns of whole Germany before World War II. That old town included around 1,200 buildings. And during World War II, so during the bombings, nearly the whole old town of Frankfurt was completely destroyed. And of those around 1,200 buildings, there was only one building remained. And that building that remained, that was Haus Wertheim, so the building at the last stop. And for the rest of the old town, it was completely destroyed. And even 20 years after World War II, so 1965, it's looked completely different than before the war. and a little bit different than we know today. Because I want to show you a picture which was taken in 1965. That's the same area where we are right now. So as you can see, it's looking completely different. And yeah, so we are right here at that area for the moment. So it's looking completely different. And the first building, which was built right here in that district after World War II, was a new town hall between 1974 and in around 1974. Just a little bit later, so it was broken down. So it was broken down before I came to Frankfurt. That's the reason why I didn't saw it with my own eyes. But I saw some pictures. To be honest, the building on some pictures, it's not that beautiful than we know today with that area. Because that building in former times was a little bit ugly, to be honest. So these buildings around are really beautiful in comparison to that building, which was built in 1974. And just later, between 2012 and 2018, there was a project of the new old town of Frankfurt. And that project included around 35 buildings. And that project, that's the place where we are right now. So the buildings around were just finished 6 years ago, because it's the new old town. And so that's firstly the reason why it was a little tricky question, to be honest, and why it is called the new old town of Frankfurt, because it is reconstructed. And so for that 35 buildings around, there were only 15 buildings who were really reconstructed from the times before World War II. And one of those buildings which were reconstructed, that's, for example, the so-called Red House in your back. And it's really hard to say why it is called the Red House. It's red. And exactly that building was photographed, or there was taken a photo of that building in 1910. So that's the same building. So as you can see from outside, it's looking nearly the same. And just from inside, it's completely new, because there are, of course, some modern laws to build some houses in Germany today. And yes, so that's one of all 15 buildings which were reconstructed. The other 20 buildings in the project, of the new old town is in Germany. So they are just a new interpretation by the old times. And one of those buildings, which was just interpreted by the old times, that's the building to my left, in the corner. So you can see inside on the right. That person is called Struwelpeter, so in English a shock-headed Peter. And the shock-headed Peter is an invention by a doctor who was born in Frankfurt. And the doctor who invented Heinrich Hoffmann, who invented shock-headed Peter, was Heinrich Hoffmann. So because Heinrich Hoffmann was born in Frankfurt, that's the reason why that person has a connection to Frankfurt. And the whole story of shock-headed Peter is simply that Peter didn't want to cut his hand, his fingernails, or he looked a little bit wild. Because he looked so wild, that's the reason why not everyone wanted to have a connection with Peter. And yes, so that's the reason why not everyone wanted to have a connection with Peter. And that's the whole story. And Shock-Headed Peter is not only that story, it's more a collection of stories at the same time. Another story inside is, for example, dealing with a little boy with the name Conrad. And Conrad was sucking on his thumbs all the time. His mom told him, don't suck on your thumbs, because when you're doing this, the tailor is coming, he's cutting off your thumbs. And one day, his mom was outside, anywhere in the city, so Conrad was alone at home, and you can guess, he was sucking on his thumbs. And suddenly, the door got open, the tailor came inside, and cut off the thumbs of Conrad. And Conrad was crying and screaming all the time. And yes, so you can see it's a little bit brutal and not really realistic, but believe it or not, that stories were a Christmas present for the 3-year-old son of Heinrich Hoffmann in 1844. So Heinrich Hoffmann walked across the city and he looked for a Christmas present for his little 3-year-old son, but in his mind, it didn't find anything which is perfect for the age of 3 years. That's the reason why he invented his own stories, and the stories of Chocolate Peter, that's the result. So originally it was written for a little boy, and just some months later, so in 1844, Heinrich Hoffmann published that stories, so in 1845, and even today it's really famous in Germany. So I guess, yeah, so I heard today there are many parents who are saying I would never ever read that stories to my children because it's too brutal. But I guess in my generation, or everyone who is older, heard of that stories in his childhood, I guess. So it's really famous in Germany today, or even today, despite of the age of 180 years. And yeah, so that's for the moment to that stories. Do you have some questions until now? As the last part of the New Old Town, right to that building to my left, so more to your right, and that building is called the House of the Golden Mark, the House of the Golden Scale, the House of the Golden Scale in the Römer. And in that case, the scale is, in my opinion, more a symbol for the merchants. Because the person who built that house in 1690 was a merchant named Abraham von Hamel, and Abraham von Hamel came by religious reasons to Frankfurt. Because he was a merchant, that's the reason why Abraham von Hamel had enough money to build a house like that one. And that was in 1690. And yeah, so in the years before World War II, it was one of the most photographed buildings in whole Frankfurt. And then came the Second World War. And that building was destroyed, like nearly the rest of the old town too. And after the Second World War, some original parts of that building were brought to some other spots of Frankfurt. And just later, so for the rebuilding program of the near old town, some of these original parts were brought back to that place, were duplicated, and were integrated inside of the new building. So inside of that building, you can see some original parts of the original building today, or even today. And so that's one of those buildings which was nearly reconstructed. And nearly, because I read one time that there are some small details which might be a little bit different. So one detail which might be a little bit different is, or are the faces and heads on the top of the ground floor. So I read one time that these faces and heads are just a modern interpretation, so made by a modern artist. And for the rest it was constructed, or nearly reconstructed, including some original parts. So some original parts I read one time too is, for example, that three of the metal elements on the top of the ground floor, that these three of them are the original parts too. So that's the reason why that is one of the reconstructed buildings. Because that is one of the reconstructed buildings, that's a really interesting fact, is that you can see on the left door, on the top of the left door, there are engraved two dates, Roman numbers. And on the left, there is engraved 1690, and on the right, 2008, for the first date as that building was built, and for the rebuilding project, 2018. So that's really interesting that here are two dates engraved. And today, it's one of the most favorite buildings in the New Old Town because it is so detailed. And yeah, so that's the last part for the new old town today, or for the moment, or from the buildings. Normally, a church has to be called only a dome when there is a bishop in the city. But Frankfurt don't have any bishops, so normally the word dome is completely wrong. The original name of that church is the Church of St. Bartholomew. And the only reasons why that church is called a dome is simply that it's the dome for the citizens of Frankfurt, and as another reason, because of the historical importance of that church. And the historical importance of that church is simply that between Charlemagne in around 800 and Franz II in 1806, there were 52 kings and emperors in the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. And not everyone, but many of that kings were elected instead of that church, and in the same time in Frankfurt. And these elections were a big difference to many other monarchies we know even today. So for example, in Great Britain, Queen Elizabeth II died around 2 years ago, and automatically her son, Charles III, became the new king of Great Britain. In Denmark, Queen Margaret II gave up her title as a queen at the beginning of that year, and automatically her son, Frederick X, so that's Frederick, he became the new king of Denmark. And so these two monarchies are monarchies of election, or of heritage. But the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, that was a monarchy of election. So 7 persons who were called Kurfürsten, the electoral princes, came together inside of Frankfurt. And these 7 electoral princes elected the new king. But in many cases, it was a really hard situation to elect a new king. And before I give you an example, I want to introduce you a little bit more the king and emperor Charles IV. And Charles IV was a king and emperor who wrote in 1356 the document of the Golden Bull. So the word bull comes in that case from the Latin word bulla, which means seal. And in that document he wrote how the election of a new king had to be. And for example, he wrote in that document that the election had to be inside of Frankfurt, and he needed 4 or more votes of the 7 electoral princes to become a new king. And there was one election, to give you one example, as a new king was elected by 3 electoral princes inside of Frankfurt, and another king at the same time by 4 electoral princes outside of Frankfurt. So every party said, we have the new and legal king, because we acted how it is written in the Golden Bull. So that's one example why there were some, of course not always, but sometimes 2 kings in the Holy Roman Empire of German nation at the same time. So yeah, and if you heard it right, I told you anything before, something of the election of a new king, but on some other cases about the kings and emperors. And normally there was no difference between king and emperor. So the only difference was that the new elected and coronated king had to be coronated by the Pope to new emperor. So the Pope was in Rome, was the only person who was able to coronate you to new emperor. So that's the only difference. For the rest it was completely the same. So not the only, but 2 of his functions of the new king and emperor was to keep the peace and to be the leader of Christianity in the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. And by the way, every emperor was a king, but not every king became an emperor. So that's a really funny thing, because first of all, I told you that first of all, you had to be a king before you could become an emperor. So that's the reason why every emperor was a king. But the Pope was able to coronate only 1 king to a new emperor, but not 2 kings. So that's the reason, or one explanation, one reason why there were, why not every king became an emperor. So that's a really interesting situation. And what you can keep in mind is I want to start more with that the king and emperor was on the top of the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. So the Holy Roman Empire of German nation was split into many different territories, like the Kingdom of Bavaria, for example, and the King of Prussia in later times. And normally, these local territories had their own ruler, so normally their own duke or their own king. But what you can keep in mind for our last stop is that in 1806, Franz II gave up his title as a king and emperor. So after 1806, the Holy Roman Empire of German nation didn't exist anymore, but the local territories, like the Kingdom of Bavaria or the Kingdom of Prussia, they remained. So that's a situation you can keep in mind, because I want to start more at the last stop at Paul's Church, more in the middle of the 19th century, so in around 1850. So it might be a little bit easier to follow when you keep in mind that that the Holy Roman Empire itself of German nation didn't exist anymore, but the little territories, they remained. So that might be a little bit easier to follow. And yes, so the elections, that was only one thing of the importance of that church. And another really important thing was that of these 52 kings and emperors, there were 10 kings who were not only elected, but also coronated inside of that church from the 16th century on. So more in the later part, in the later time of the empire. So that's another really, really important thing for that church. And after the coronation, the new elected and coronated king went rather that way where we came from, or nearly that way where we came from, to go to Römer, the Roman hill, so the place where we started our tour, or where we met each other. And at that place, there was a big party for the new king. So that's another reason why Römer was a little bit important in history too. And the church we know today is a relatively new church, because normally, or originally, there was a much older church in that place before, in the time around 800 to 850 AD. So that original church became bigger and bigger until the church we know today was finished. And as that church was finished, that war, or how we know today as it was finished, was in around the 19th century. So the modern view, that's relatively new. So that's a really interesting thing. But nevertheless, the original church on that place, so in around 800 to 850 AD, that church had a connection with the residence in Frankfurt, which was located just some meters in that direction, so to my left. And yes, so that residence isn't existing today anymore. And to be honest, it's unfortunately closed today. It's just open between Wednesday and Sunday, between 1 and 5:30 p.m. But nevertheless, we can see it from outside. So when the group is done, the next group in front of that residence, we can go to that spot. So I can introduce you a little bit more of that residence of Frankfurt. But I want to use the chance to ask if you have any questions for the moment. From right here, when the group is going, then we can go to that spot. So, so that's a little bit. That might be a little bit. Germany. So there was another residence, for example, in Gelnhausen, in the east of Frankfurt. And another residence was in Worms, for example. And another residence, to give you a third example, was located in Aachen, so right on the border to Belgium and the Netherlands. And Aachen is even today really famous, and because it was the most favorite residence of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne was buried in Aachen. So the kings and emperors had to move from city to city, from residence to residence, to reign over the territory. And the reason is, for sure, they didn't have the same infrastructure we know today. So it was much harder to control the territory from just one point, as we know today. So the territory was too big to control it from just one point in that times. That's the reason why there were many different territories. And just later, in around the 11th to 12th century, the residence was given up. So on the time later, from the 11th to 12th century on, there was on that place the residence of Frankfurt too, or the old town of Frankfurt was on that place too. So that was in the time before World War II the same case. So on that place it was the new old town, or the old town of Frankfurt, in the time before World War II. And for now, we can move to that spot for just for short, then I can introduce you a little bit more. Okay, so right here, as promised, you can see some ruins of the residence of Frankfurt. And as I said, it's only open between Wednesday and Sunday. But nevertheless, we can see a small part of that residence from outside. And yes, so as I told you before, or some moments ago, that right here, there was, before World War II, the old town of Frankfurt. So even in that time, so even before World War II, the citizens of Frankfurt knew there was a residence in Frankfurt, but yeah, the longer the time ran away from that this residence was given up, the more the citizens forgot where exactly the residence was. So they knew there was a residence, but they didn't know where exactly. And then came World War II with the bombings to Frankfurt. And these bombings to Frankfurt were something like a curse and a blessing at the same time for that place. Because, for example, right here, many buildings were destroyed. So many persons became homeless. Alone in Frankfurt, and just because of the bombings, more than 5,500 persons died during World War II, just because of the bombings. So that's something like a curse for that place. But at the same time, it's a blessing, because without the bombings, the archaeologists couldn't do their work after World War II. So without the bombings and without the archaeologists, we couldn't see the ruins today, and at the same time, we wouldn't know where exactly the residence was. So that's in some ways the reason why that bombings were a little bit like a curse and a blessing at the same time for that place. And not only the residence of Frankfurt was right here on that place, so I'm not sure if you noticed it, right here there's a small map of that residence, of the former residence. More on the right side, more on the top of that map, there's a blue circle. Yeah, it's formed like a circle in blue. And that circle was in former times something like a bathroom in in the antiquity. So today there's reconstructed inside of that round structure. There's reconstructed hypocaustum. So hypocaustum, that was a Roman bathroom in antiquity. And right here on that place, there was nearly 2,000 years ago a Roman military camp on that area, on that bigger area. And just later, the Romans gave up that military camp. So there was a gap of some centuries between that military camp and the first settlement in the Frankish period. And because of that gap, Frankfurt is, in my opinion, more a Frankish foundation and less a Roman one, despite of the Roman ruins. But because Frankfurt had the first constant settlement from the Frankish period on. So that's for the moment. Do you have some other questions for the moment? The same, yes.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Because it's not the first military target, the
Yeah.
church, where so many civilians are
Yes,
sheltered.
yes, and no,
They
but,
use those landmarks very well.
yes, it started more with some industries at the beginning, and we had some military parts at the bombings, but nevertheless was a complete destruction later. So that didn't. It was nearly the same with the trains, but the LST that didn't really care about was just bothering to demoralize construction, to demoralize.
Mas também te digo uma coisa, mas o frio é seco, mesmo a chover, e o nosso lar é um horroroso.
Family. But I want to start with the beginnings. And the beginning is that the first Jewish community in Frankfurt was firstly named in the 12th century, so more than 800 years ago. And the first Jewish cemetery in Frankfurt was firstly named in the 13th century. That Jewish cemetery from the 13th century is right behind my back, behind the walls. And that Jewish cemetery was in use for around 600 years. So the last funerals site were in the 19th century. With the 13th century as the first date of naming, that the second oldest Jewish cemetery in whole Germany. So the oldest one is in Worms, in one of the very cities with modern residents. And the second oldest one is right here. The oldest gravestone inside, which is the dated date, is from the 1270s. And yes, so from the time between the 15th and the late 18th century, right here on that place where we are right now, was the southeastern part of the Jewish quarter too, at the same time. So that Jewish quarter was something like a ghetto in some ways, with many restrictions against the Jewish population. So for example, it was forbidden for the Jewish population to live and to work outside of that Jewish quarter, and it was forbidden for them to leave the quarter at night. So there were many restrictions against the Jewish population in that times, and a little bit better the situation became for the Jewish population in the years after 1796, because in that years the French troops came to Frankfurt to occupy the city. And during that occupation, the city, or some parts of the city, and the northern part of the Jewish quarter was destroyed. So after the occupation of Frankfurt, the citizens of Frankfurt were able to live and to work outside of the Jewish quarter. And nevertheless, the Jewish quarter was finally given up just 15 years later, so in 1811. And with around 1800, it was one of the last Jewish quarters in whole Germany. And nevertheless, the Jewish population didn't have the same right than the other citizens in Frankfurt. The same rights they just got in 1864, so 160 years ago. And but for now, I want to introduce a little bit more Anne Frank and her family, or the connection of Anne Frank and her family to that place. And for that connection, we can go a little bit closer to the wall. Because right here on that walls, there's written every Jewish person who was born in Frankfurt and or who was deported from Frankfurt to a German concentration camp during World War II. And every person you can see right here was murdered during the Second World War, during the Holocaust. So to give you a little example is the family Frank. So Anna, or normally Annelies Frank, the sister Margot, and their mom Edith they died during the Second World War in Bergen-Belsen in a German concentration camp, really close to, I think it's not too far away from Hanover. And because Anna and Margot, because they were born in Frankfurt, that's the reason why they are registered at that walls today. And the only person of at all 8 in that building where they had their hiding place in Amsterdam, the only person of those 8 persons who survived was Otto Frank. So the father of Anna and Margot. And Otto Frank was born in Frankfurt, but because he survived, that's the reason why he is not registered at that walls today, because he survived. And the other 4 persons, they were murdered, but because they didn't were born in Frankfurt and because they didn't were deported from Frankfurt to a German concentration camp, that's the reason why they are not registered at that walls too. So it's only for those persons, for those Jewish persons with a connection to Frankfurt, and for those persons who were murdered. And so it is today categorized by names, by the last name. So it is beginning with A behind the corner, the street. F like Frank is behind the corner too. Right here is L like Levi, for example. And the other end is with Z behind the other corner. So to my left and more to your right. And under the name there's written the date when the person was born. And if you note, the date when the person was murdered. So on the bottom there's registered the place where the person was deported to, so where the person was murdered. And in that case it's, for example, Majdanek in modern Poland, like Lodz or like Auschwitz, so I guess the most famous German concentration camp, or one of the most famous ones, Minsk in modern Belarus, and Riga in Latvia, or Theresienstadt in modern Czech Republic. And some other parts like Mauthausen, for example, in modern Austria, and right here Sachsenhausen, for example. Sachsenhausen is really close to Berlin, or was really close to Berlin. And sometimes there's written unbekannt, which means unknown. So we don't know where the person was deported to, or where the person was murdered. So, by the way, on most of the names you can find some little rocks. These little rocks, that's a Jewish tradition to remember the dead persons. And today that place is a place of remembrance, to remember that dark times of German history, and perhaps the darkest time in German history. And what do you guess, how many names are registered at that walls today? What do you guess? Right here on that wall with how many names. So to give you a little remembrance, it's only for those Jewish persons who were murdered, and only those Jewish persons. And because music, because many persons are saying it is making music because, when you eat it in your stomach. So because it is made of oil, salt, pepper, onions, caraway seeds, and vinegar. And traditionally it will be served with a piece of bread. And yes, so that's just a little warning. It's a small little snack and not a full meal. It's a small little snack. Another thing I want to introduce here is Handkäse mit Nutten. That was the thing I had. Apfelwein. So in the middle. So on the left, for you it's at the left, you can see a bundle. So Apfelwein will be served inside of a bundle when you order some bigger versions in a restaurant. So for example, 1 or 1.5 liter. And the painting of the bundle is really famous for Frankfurt. But when you want to drink Apfelwein, you drink it from outside of the red glass, which you can see on the right. So the red glass has the name the red glass, on the local dialect, Gerippes, because of the lines as a structure outside. So when you eat, you can hold it better in your hand. And in Frankfurt it's like a national drink. So it's really famous for Frankfurt, because I read one time that 70% of Apfelwein, which is produced in Germany, will be drunken in or around Frankfurt. So more than 2/3. And in a restaurant, you will normally be asked if you want to drink it pure, sweet or sour. So the pure version is that version I prefer. So it's without anything. The sour version is Apfelwein in a mix of a little bit of water. And the sweet version is Apfelwein in a mix of a little bit of water. So, but just a little warning, Apfelwein has a little bit more alcohol than beer. So beer has around 4.5 to 5% normally alcohol. And Apfelwein has in many cases around 5.5% alcohol, or nearly 6% sometimes. So it might be with a little bit more alcohol than beer. And yes, so I think for Apfelwein, I think that's it. For the last two things, I want to present you Frankfurter grüne Soße, the green sauce of Frankfurt, which you can see on the bottom on the right. And Frankfurter grüne Soße, the green sauce of Frankfurt, will be served with potatoes and eggs as a classical meal, and it will be made of 7 herbs. Every herb has to be produced inside of Frankfurt, and yeah, so that's a really special thing. And there are some variations, and one variation is, for example, Frankfurter Schnitzel. So that means it's schnitzel with the green sauce of Frankfurt, but the traditional meal is vegetarian, so with potatoes and eggs. And last but not least, all over Germany there are many different types of sausages. But Frankfurt has an own type of sausage, I think which you named at the beginning. Frankfurter Würstchen, the sausage of Frankfurt, which you can see on the bottom on the left. So it's the left. And Frankfurter Würstchen, the sausage of Frankfurt, will be served with a salad of potatoes, classically. And that's a really typical meal for Christmas Eve in Germany. So for example, my family and me, we had a salad of potatoes too last year at Christmas Eve, but with a little variation. If I remember it right, we didn't have the sausage of Frankfurt, Frankfurter Würstchen. We had the sausage of Vienna, Wiener Würstchen. And these two sausages are looking nearly the same, but there are two differences. The first difference is that the sausage of Frankfurt was invented in Frankfurt, and the sausage of Vienna was invented by a person who was born in Frankfurt. But that person, but the legend I heard is that the sausage of Frankfurt had something like a copyright, so he wasn't able to name it after his birthplace. So that's the legend I heard. And so he had to use another name, which was, so he decided for the name of the city where he lived, and that was Vienna. So the sausage of Vienna and the sausage of Frankfurt. And the other difference is that the sausage of Vienna is made of pork and beef, the sausage of Frankfurt is made of pork. So these are the two differences. And to be honest, sometimes I make a little bit of self-ironic jokes and fun of some cities and villages for some food. So for example, I grew up in a small village with the name Burg. The persons inside of Burg are called or called Burger, which is written the same like burger. So I am a burger by birth. But today I live in Frankfurt, so I'm a sausage of Frankfurt today. So that's by the way. So for now we can go inside through the Kleinmarkthalle, so you can have a closer look what is inside. But just one little thing. There's only one stop remaining, and Kleinmarkthalle is open until 6 p.m. So I think there will be enough time to come back after the tour, because there's only one stop left if you want to have a closer look to that market hall. So we meet each other in just 1 or 2 minutes right on the other side of the market hall, and then we go to our next stop, which is in the same time our last stop for today.
Oțalați Valentina Gianni.
Handcase with music. Benches with music. Okay. So it's a little bit. So, to be honest, it's not for everyone. So it's a little bit. Because of that dynasty of kings and emperors, that's the reason why that wall is called Staufermauer.
First city wall of
And
Frankfurt.
that wall was something like a circle around Frankfurt. So I want to show it to you on a map. And that city wall started not by a local king or duke, but by a local council. And that council was not able to give you the permission to expand as a city, as an independent city. So that's for the moment. Do you have some questions? Okay. So if not, let's go to a next spot, and I think there's a little bit. 1954, so 70 years ago. And in June there was a big celebration because of 70 years of Kleinmarkttag, so 70 years of a small market hall. And today you can find many different things inside. So, for example, at least one shop for flowers and some honey or some fish, wine. You can find some vegetables, some herbs, butchers, bakeries, and some international food. Because there's so much food inside, that's the reason why I want to introduce you a little bit more some of the local food. So I want to start with a cake, which is called Frankfurter Kranz. Normally, that cake is a bigger cake. And that cake you can see on the left, for you it's at the left, and normally it's a bigger cake. So in diameter, it's around that size in diameter. So when you order Frankfurter Kranz, you get only one slice. But sometimes I saw a tiny version of that cake, and that tiny version is perfect for 1 or 2 persons. So if you are a lucky person, you can get a tiny version, or if you find a normal size, you get only one slice of that cake. And the second thing is...
What makes the cake special? What's in it?
So it's like a buttercream, or it's and because music, because many persons are saying it is making music because, when you eat it in your stomach. So because it is made of oil, salt, pepper, onions, caraway seeds, and vinegar. And traditionally it will be served with a piece of bread. And yeah, so that's just a little warning. It's more a little snack and not a full meal. It's more a little snack. Another thing I want to introduce here is Handcase mit that was the thing I had. Apfelwein. So in the middle. So on the left, for you it's at the left, you can see a bundle. So Apfelwein will be served inside of a bamble when you order some bigger versions in a restaurant. So for example, 1 or 1.5 liter. And the painting of the bamble is really famous for Frankfurt. But when you want to drink Apfelwein, you drink it from outside of the ribbed glass, which you can see on the right. So the ribbed glass has the name, the ribbed glass, on the local dialect, Gerippes, because of the lines as a structure outside. So when you eat, you can hold it better in your hand. And in Frankfurt, it's like a national drink. So it's really famous for Frankfurt, because I read one time that 70% of Apfelwein, which is produced in Germany, will be drunken in or around Frankfurt. So more than 2/3. And in a restaurant, you will normally be asked if you want to drink it pure, sweet or sour. So the pure version is that version I prefer, so it's without anything. The sour version is Apfelwein in a mix of a little bit of water. And the sweet version is Apfelwein in a mix of a little bit of water. So, but just a little warning, Apfelwein has a little bit more alcohol than beer. So beer has around 4.5 to 5% normally alcohol, and Apfelwein has in many cases around 5.5% alcohol, or nearly 6% sometimes. So it might be with a little bit more alcohol than beer. And yes, so I think for Apfelwein, I think that's it. For the last two things, I want to present you Frankfurter grüne Soße, the green sauce of Frankfurt, which you can see on the bottom on the right. And Frankfurter grüne Soße, the green sauce of Frankfurt, will be served with potatoes and eggs as a classical meal, and it will be made of 7 herbs. Every herb has to be produced inside of Frankfurt, and yeah, so that's a really special thing. And there are some variations, and one variation is, for example, Frankfurter Schnitzel. So that means it's schnitzel with the green sauce of Frankfurt, but the traditional meal is vegetarian, so with potatoes and eggs. And last but not least, all over Germany there are many different types of sausages. But Frankfurt has an own type of sausage, I think, which you named at the beginning. Frankfurter Würstchen, the sausage of Frankfurt, which you can see on the bottom on the left, for you to the left. And Frankfurter Würstchen, the sausage of Frankfurt, will be served with a salad of potatoes, classically. And that's a really typical meal for Christmas Eve in Germany. So for example, my family and me, we had a salad of potatoes too last year at Christmas Eve, but with a little variation. If I remember it right, we didn't have the sausage of Frankfurt, Frankfurter Würstchen. We had the sausage of Vienna, Wiener Würstchen. And these two sausages are looking nearly the same, but there are two differences. The first difference is that the sausage of Frankfurt was invented in Frankfurt, and the sausage of Vienna was invented by a person who was born in Frankfurt. But that person, but the legend I heard is that the sausage of Frankfurt had something like a copyright, so he wasn't able to name it after his birthplace. So that's the legend I heard. And so he had to use another name, which was, so he decided for the name of the city where he lived, and that was Vienna. So the sausage of Vienna and the sausage of Frankfurt. And the other difference is that the sausage of Vienna is made of pork and beef, the sausage of Frankfurt is made of pork. So these are the two differences. And to be honest, sometimes I make a little bit of self-ironic jokes and fun of some cities and villages with some food. So for example, I grew up in a small village with the name Burg. The persons inside of Burg are called or called Burger, which is written the same like burger. So I am a burger by birth. But today I live in Frankfurt, so I'm a sausage of Frankfurt today. So that's by the way. So for now we can go inside through the Kleinmarkthalle, so you can have a closer look what is inside. But just one little thing. There's only one stop remaining, and Kleinmarkthalle is open until 6 p.m. So I think there will be enough time to come back after the tour, because there's only one stop left if you want to have a closer look to that market hall. So we meet each other in just 1 or 2 minutes right on the other side of the market hall. And then we go to our next stop, which is in the same time our last stop for today.
طلعت فالنتينا كانوا
Handcase with music. Benches with music. Okay. So it's a little bit. So, to be honest, it's not for everyone. So it's a little bit. Post church is really important for the latest German history, because in 1848 and 49, instead of that church, was the National Assembly of Frankfurt. And how that assembly looked like, I want to show you in a picture. And yeah, so the picture, the persons on the top, these were some visitors, and the persons on the bottom, these were some members of the assembly. So that's how the assembly looked like around 175 years ago. And that assembly was like the first parliament with the first constitution inside of Germany. And that assembly was successful, and it failed in the same time. It failed because I told you before that the Holy Roman Empire of German nation didn't exist anymore after 1806. And the local kings of the local territories, and especially the King of Prussia, they didn't want to accept the constitution. So after the assembly, nearly nothing changed, and after the assembly it was nearly the same situation than before the assembly. And the fact that Germany is a unity we know today, that needed some centuries and some decades until the unity we know today in Germany happened. So the first step to a unity was in Germany in 1871 with the new emperorship. But that emperorship had, of course, many differences to the modern German state, to the modern German country. Because first of all, today we have a democracy. In 1871 to 1918, it was a monarchy, so an emperorship. And another reason is that Germany is divided into 16 different states today. And every state is completely equal. And it doesn't matter how many persons are living inside, or how big, how small that state is, every state is equal. But in 1871, the emperor was at the same time the king of Prussia. So Prussia was like the leading state inside of Germany in that times. So the next change was in 1918. So after World War I, with the first democracy in Germany, and that was the Republic of Weimar. But that first democracy was relatively weak in comparison to today, to the modern German democracy. And because that constitution or that democracy was relatively weak in comparison to today, that was the reason why the constitution or why the democracy in 1933 was able to fail. So it was not, of course, not the only reason, but one reason. So today it's much more stable with the constitution and with Germany as a country. So that's the reason why today it's not really that easy than 91 years ago. So from 1933, it was able to turn into a dictatorship. And so that dictatorship led to World War II in the times between 1939 and 1945. And just 4 years later, so on 23rd of May 1949, the constitution of the modern German state was signed. So the modern German state, the Federal Republic of Germany, was founded in 1949. So it's a relatively young state in comparison to some other countries. And yeah, so the constitution, which was signed on 23rd of May 1949, that's the reason, or one reason, why the assembly instead of that church in 1848 and 1849 was successful in the same time. Because the modern constitution of Germany is, of course, not the same constitution, which was written inside 175 years ago, but it's basing on that constitution. So that's the reason why that place is called by many persons the birthplace of German democracy, with that church. And for sure, after 1949, the German history didn't stop, because between 1949 and 1990, we had two different German states. And Eastern Berlin was the capital of Eastern Germany, and Western Berlin was part of Western Germany, but not the capital. And in my opinion, especially in Western Berlin, the political situation was too hard and unstable that the city could become the new capital. So Western Germany needed another capital. And for the new capital, there were two candidates, Bonn and Frankfurt. And there are some reasons why Bonn became the new capital of Western Germany, not Frankfurt. One reason is, or was, that Frankfurt was too important, with much more, too big importance, too big influence as a city before World War II. So many persons and politicians didn't want to see Frankfurt with much more importance and with much more influence as a capital. So that's the reason why they decided for Bonn and against Frankfurt. Another reason might be that Konrad Adenauer, so the first Chancellor of Western Germany, was born in Cologne, and he lived in Cologne, which is much closer to Bonn than to Frankfurt. So some persons are saying that he didn't want to drive really far to his borough and back to his home, or he decided for Bonn against Frankfurt. And yes, so there are some reasons and explanations why Bonn became the new capital of Western Germany, not Frankfurt. And then came 1990 with the reunification day on the 3rd of October. And by the way, that's the reason why the 3rd of October, the reunification day, is a national day today in Germany. So that's a little fun fact, by the way. So from 1990 on, Berlin became the new and old capital of whole Germany again. And and today Frankfurt is inside of Hessen, so one of the 16 states. And what do you guess? What's the capital of Hessen today? Yeah, it's not Frankfurt. You're right. It was a little tricky question again, because Frankfurt is by far the biggest city in Frankfurt in Germany. It's neither of Frankfurt nor of Germany. It's the biggest city inside of Hessen today, with around 770,000 persons. But it's not the capital. And the reason is, or the background is, that in 1949, so the capital of Western Germany, and even the candidate of a Western German capital, couldn't be in the same time the capital of a state inside of Germany. Because Frankfurt was the candidate of the Western German capital, that's the reason why Hessen needed another capital. And the new capital of Hessen became Wiesbaden, so the second biggest city in Hessen, with around 280,000 persons. So Wiesbaden, is the second biggest city, has just a little bit more than 1/3 of the population of Frankfurt today. So so Frankfurt is something like a loser for the political capital. But nevertheless, there's some politics in Frankfurt today. For example, with Römer, for example, as the town hall of Frankfurt today, so the headquarters of Lord Mayor of Frankfurt. And in my back, House Church was opened as a church in 1844, but today it's not really a classical church, because it will be more used today for some political events or for some political debates and some cultural events. And for example, I heard that a German minister got an award inside last year, and Queen Elizabeth II, I heard, was some years ago inside too, and John F. Kennedy had a speech in 1963 inside of that church. So for sure there's some politics, but nevertheless Frankfurt is much more important for some other parts, like the airport, for example, as the biggest airport in whole Germany, and as another part with finance. So as the headquarter was the location of some headquarters for many banks, like Commerzbank, for example, as a German bank, and the European Central Bank. And that's, by the way, the reason why Frankfurt is, for politics, something like a loser for the political capital, but nevertheless like something like the financial capital in whole Germany. So it's like a financial winner. And yes, so that's the reason why there are some other really important things in Frankfurt, despite of the political history. And yes, so that's just for short for the moment. Do you have some questions until now? Okay, so if not,